70-742, Lesson 5, Maintaining Active Directory. What are we talking about? Maintaining Active Directory. Well, we're talking about backing up and restoring Active Directory. We're talking about managing it offline, optimizing the database because it's a database, cleaning up metadata, managing our Active Directory replication, and that entails both intra-site replication and inter-site replication. We'll learn what the difference is between those. And we're going to go through the process of backing up Active Directory. When was the last time that it was convenient for your server to crash? I mean, it's inevitable, right? At some point, a server is going to fail. What are you going to do? You need to have current backups, not just a backup, but it's got to be current. And remember, Active Directory can be constantly changing, so this is something that may be a little bit more complicated to keep backed up, but there's ways to restore that backup so that we don't cause corruption. Because remember, you need to have a minimum of 2 domain controllers. That means 2 replicated copies of your Active Directory at all times. If one domain controller crashes, the other one maintains availability for your network, for your users, for your computers, for your objects. But what happens when you restore that crashed server? Let's say it was just a faulty piece of RAM or a power supply or a component, but for whatever reason it took a day or two to receive that component to be replaced. You replace the failed component. Do you simply just turn the domain controller back on? Well, what about in the time that domain controller was down, on the other domain controller, passwords were being updated, new user accounts were being created, computers that were no longer needed were unjoined from the domain, maybe a replacement computer was joined in its place. However, when you restored that failed domain controller and turned it back on, the Active Directory on it didn't know anything about all those changes. So now that new user can't log on because you got a domain controller that says the user account doesn't exist. Corruption in your database. It can become corrupted. So we need to learn on how to do an authoritative restore, how to do a non-authoritative restore. We'll be looking at that. That's part of restoring Active Directory backup. So what is a backup? As you can see, a backup, or the process of backing up, refers to making copies of data so that those additional copies can be used to restore the original if some type of loss occurs. We can restore entire systems following a disaster, or restore subsets, small sets of files or objects that are accidentally deleted or corrupted. So let's take a look at what Active Directory actually uses. The database uses what's called the Extensible Storage Engine, the ESE. And as you can see, it's an indexed and sequential access method database, ISAM. The ESENT.dll dynamic link library indexes the data in the database, and it provides the mechanism to store and retrieve data. There are a number of other files that are part of it. The ntds.dit, that's the physical database file in which all the directory data is stored. Within that file, there's 3 tables: the data table, the link table, and the SD security descriptor table. It contains the schema information, configuration information, and domain information. We also have the EDB log, and that's where transactions are written before being committed to the database file. Now, transaction logs, transactions, this is all database talk. This is not a database class, but understand what these terminologies are. The transaction logs used by the ESE are 10 megabytes in size. The edb.chk, it's a file that's used to track the point up to where transactions in the log have been committed. See, it's important to know what's been committed and what has not been yet. That's why there's different files. There's also the res1.log and res2.log files, and these are used to reserve space for additional log files if the edb.log might become full. And there's also a temp.edb, and it's a file that's used as quote-unquote a scratch pad to store information about in-process large transaction and to hold pages out of the ntds.dit during maintenance operations. Now, we can use Windows Backup to back up a system or back up our system state. What is the system state? The Windows system state, it's a collection of components. They're not contained in a simple file, but can be backed up easily. In the system state, we have our boot files, such as the boot manager, your DLL cache folder. Remember what's DLL? Dynamic Link Library. It backs the system state contains your registry, your sysvol, and that's where your group policy and logon scripts are at. It contains the Active Directory ntds.dit. That's the database, right? If we're running a certificate authority, it contains the certificate store. All your user profiles are there. The COM plus and WMI information, clustering information, IIS metabase, and system files that are under Windows Resource Protection. So if you're going to back up a system, you have to include the system state. If you need to back up your Active Directory, you need to back up the system state. That's the only way to be sure that you get all the Active Directory components. Now, one of the items in there that we mentioned was the sysvol, S-Y-S-V-O-L. It's a shared directory, and it stores the server copy of the domain's public files. And these need to be shared for common access and replication throughout a domain. In that sysvol folder, you're going to find logon scripts. You're going to find your Windows group policy, the configured settings. You're also going to find your DFS. Remember DFS from our previous text? The distributed file system staging folder and files. That's the folders and files that are used to synchronize data and files between domain controllers. So, yes, we learned about DFS, but this is what DFS is used for in terms of synchronizing data and files between domain controllers. And what's called file system junctions. And this is a physical location on the hard disk that points to data that's located somewhere else. So if you're restoring Active Directory, you're restoring that system state, you need to decide whether or not you're going to do a non-authoritative restore or an authoritative restore of that Active Directory. Okay, so if you do a non-authoritative restore, you restore a backup of Active Directory, and then the Active Directory domains service restarts on the domain controller, and the domain controller contacts all the other domain controllers to get updates since the backups were completed. The other domain controller or controllers replicate the information to the restored domain controller so that they're the same. So, if there's problems such as corrupt data or missing objects within the database that is stored in all the domain controllers, the same information is sent to the restored domain controller, and that same problem would still exist. Understand, you only use a non-authoritative restore if the problem has not spread to the other domain controllers, or you want to restore the domain controller so it is functional again. So that would be the case of the domain controller that crashed due to a failure. In other words, your Active Directory is good. The server failed and went offline for a period of time. And when you restore that server and bring Active Directory back up, you have to do it in such a way that the old stale data doesn't become the active data. You do a non-authoritative restore. In an authoritative restore, it is termed an override type of restore, such that the information on the restored domain controller will be replicated to all the other domain controllers. To restore an object or container within Active Directory that has been inadvertently deleted, you need to perform an authoritative restore. If you have a copy of your Active Directory and somehow an object gets deleted that you cannot restore through any other process, by restoring an authoritative restore of a backup that does contain that deleted object, you would be able to restore it that way. When an authoritative restore is performed, Windows increments the version number to be higher than any other version number used on any other domain controller or controllers. And therefore, they see that as being the copy that needs to be replicated from. Now, if you are going to perform an authoritative restore of an object, or what we call a subtree, you need to know the distinguished name of the object. For example, the user object for JSmith, the account for JSmith, in the sales OU of the contoso.com domain would have a distinguished name of CN equals JSmith, OU equals sales, DC equals Contoso, DC equals com. That is the distinguished name. When you do an authoritative restore, what is called a backlinks file is created. It's a reference to an attribute within another object that also needs to be restored with the object. For example, if you have an authoritatively restored user object and it was the member of 5 Active Directory groups, that backlink file to each one of those groups needs to be restored so that the user is added again to each one of those groups. That's what that does. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so beginning with Windows Server 2008 R2, and if you remember from our discussions, that coincides with Windows 7 SP1, we now have the availability of the Active Directory Recycle Bin. It's similar to the recycle bin on your Windows desktop, in that it's used to recover deleted files. You can use this to recover deleted Active Directory containers and objects. What's an object? Well, a user account's an object. A computer account is an object. And you'll see where we do this. When an object or an OU in Active Directory is deleted, it gets moved to the deleted objects container. Now understand, you have to enable the Active Directory Recycle Bin first. It's not enabled by default. You can do it through the GUI with the Active Directory Administrative Center, or you can do it through PowerShell. As long as the object has not been scavenged by what's called the garbage collection process after reaching the end of the object's tombstone lifespan, you can restore the deleted object. However, when the item's deleted, certain attributes are removed, such as group membership. So you may still need to restore those group memberships. Now understand that garbage collection process occurs every 12 hours. So you've got a 12-hour window to restore an accidentally deleted item. Okay, so this is an important point. As of Windows Server 2012, we now have the ability to have a restartable Active Directory domain services. Up until that point, if we made a change, such as defragging the Active Directory database, we would have to reboot the domain controller. We'd have to do it in DSRM, Directory Services Restore mode. We could not do those processes while the domain controller was online. However, as of Windows Server 2012, with this restartable directories domain services, we can start and stop the ADDS service without restarting the domain controller. The result is we can do a lot of these tasks much faster than we could before. Now, like any database, like any file structure, sometimes you need to defrag it. You need to maintain it. How do you do this? You have a command line utility, the NTDS util, and you use this to work with your Active Directory database, and you'll be looking at that. For example, from your textbook, you would stop your Active Directory domain services. You would then enter a command prompt. You would type in NTDS util, press enter. You would then type in activate instance NTDS. You would then press enter. You would then type files and press enter. And then the defragmentation process would commence. And you can see it progress right here. So no, you can't right click and say I want to optimize my drive. Well, you can't do that with Active Directory. This is the process, but it's as simple as a command prompt, or rather stop Active Directory domain services, run a command prompt, NTDS util, type the command activate, a space, instance, a space, NTDS, press enter, type files, press enter, and it commences. Once that's complete, you can enter the command integrity and verify the integrity of the offline database. You might then perform the database consistency check as shown, execute go. Once it's done, quit twice, close the command prompt window, and then go back to your services and restart the ADDS. What is Active Directory replication? Well, just as you see, it is a critical piece of every Active Directory domain services. If we make a change on one domain controller, it needs to be replicated to any other domain controllers in the enterprise. This keeps them all up to date, keeps all change the same, and this could be anything from schema updates to modifying items as a simple group membership, or a new user account, a computer join, whatever it might be. ADDS replication occurs between two or more domain controllers, a source domain controller, and a replica domain controller. It does the following. It replicates new changes and updates. It replicates updates of directory objects. It ensures all directory updates are transferred to a replica partner. It keeps all the directory partitions up to date. It keeps all the domain controllers synchronized. And it also replicates the contents of the sysvol folder. If you create a new group policy, you're doing that on one device, one domain controller. Well, that group policy needs to get replicated to any of your other domain controllers. This is how that mechanism occurs. With the replication process, domain controllers keep each other informed about changes happening. Put simply, a change made on a domain controller and it is then replicated to a replica domain controller. It can occur within a site. It can occur between domain controllers within a site. That's our intra-site replication. Or between domain controllers in separate sites. That's our inter-site replication. So understand that It occurs using what's called a change notification, and that's between domain controllers located within a site. Intra-site replication is considered notify-pull replication. What that means is the source domain controller notifies a replica, and then the replica requests the changes. Hey, I've done something different. There's been a change. You need to request a copy of the Active Directory. That change is then requested by the replica, and the change is sent. There's a number of different ways in that replication. It can occur as an urgent replication, non-urgent password change replication, also replication conflicts. Urgent replication, it allows for directory information, critical directory information, to be delivered to replica domain controllers without waiting the normal 15-second and 3-second subsequent intervals. For example, if a user account locks out on a domain controller, that domain controller urgently replicates the lockout to what we call our primary domain controller emulator. The PDC emulator then urgently replicates the lockout to any other domain controllers. Because if someone's locked out, you want them locked out everywhere. This can occur with account lockouts, changes in account lockout policies, changes in a domain password policy, and changes of a domain controller account password. These are all things that you want to happen immediately, instantly. We have non-urgent replication, and this does not include account lockouts or password policies. The password change replication is what allows domain controllers to reference one domain controller in the event a password has been changed on one domain controller, and the change has not yet replicated through the enterprise. The PDC, when a user changes his password, that password change gets immediately sent to the PDC emulator. The PDC emulator then initiates a non-urgent replication with its replica domain controllers. If the user attempts to log on to a domain controller and the domain controller has not yet received the password change, the domain controller that the user is authenticating against checks with the PDC emulator to see whether it knows the user's latest password. If the PDC emulator has the latest password, it authenticates the user and replicates the new password to the domain controller that the user is attempting to authenticate against, who got a failed logon, and it gets really convoluted, right? Okay. If a domain controller changes a user's password and it can't contact the PDC emulator, then that password change gets included in the next non-urgent replication cycle. I know, it's a lot, but understand how those processes work. When some is immediate, some is not immediate. Okay, so we touched upon intrasite. Intersite replication is replicated between domain controllers in different sites. If you've got an enterprise and you've got a dozen different domain controllers and they're in 4 different sites, in other words, let's say all things being equal, you've got 3 domain controllers in 4 different sites. Are you going to have all 12 communicating with all 12? That's a lot of connections. No, you will have intrasite between each of the 3 domain controllers, and then one of those domain controllers may have a connection to 3 other domain controllers, one being in each of the other 3 sites. So, domain controllers in different sites across a wide area network. Again, it is considered a request pull. This means that what we call our bridgehead server, that's the one that's in charge of controlling communication between sites. Replica bridgehead server in one site requests the changes from the source bridgehead server. So source bridgehead server says, hey, I've got some changes, please request them. The replica then requests the changes from the source. Now, most of this replication all happens automatically, But you as an administrator, you can control it. We can use from our command prompt the repadmin command. We can use PowerShell. We can also use the Active Directory Sites and Services tool. We'll be looking at all that. Let's take a quick look at some of the repadmin commands that you can utilize. Here you are in your textbook. We can use the repadmin sync all. We can use it with the /A switch, /D, E, H, J, Q. There's many different switches that we can use. Now, let's say we have an organization that we work for, and we've got a big headquarters, and we've got a lot of little tiny branches. The example would be we have our headquarters, and then we've got a lot of small points of presence, branches, locations, and there's only a couple users. But these users, they need to be able to log onto the network. They need to be able to access network shares. They need to be able to authenticate and get authorization. But we've got a very slow connection. They don't need to have high-speed bandwidth connections because bandwidth is expensive. Bandwidth is expensive, especially when it comes to a business. In your home, if your internet goes down, if your data circuit goes down, it's an inconvenience. If the data circuit for your business goes down, it's a loss of revenue to the point where you may go out of business. Business circuits have to have guarantees. They have to have SLAs, service level agreements. Because there has to be a guarantee of service, business data circuits are much more expensive. Bandwidth costs money. Therefore, if there's not a need for bandwidth, you're going to spend the least amount of money possible. If you need to be able to control the amount of data being passed back and forth, you may want to utilize read-only domain controllers, RODCs. And just as the slide shows, it's where there's a need for a domain controller. It doesn't necessarily have a secured physical environment, or there may be a risk to theft. But there's not a need for a full-blown domain controller. We can use it in cases like this. For example, if an RODC is stolen and compromised, all the user accounts that have authenticated against that RODC and have had their passwords cached will need to have their passwords changed because their account were compromised and the business is at risk. But the only accounts that will be cached on that are the ones for the users in that location. It's not going to contain everything. So you say, well, how, if this is read-only, how did those credentials get there? You can do what's called a password pre-population. And it's the ability for a domain controller to store user credentials before the user logs on to the RODC. This allows user credentials to be pushed to the RODC before the user attempts to log on to the RODC. This gives faster initial logons, and it also gives you the ability to prepare an RODC before shipment to the remote site. So you could fully configure the domain controller, send it to the remote site, and remember, this is a read-only, so having it go offline for a short period of time is not a problem. When it comes up, all it does is read, so any new change is going to get replicated to it. So this was a condensed version of your lesson. Your lesson contains much more than just what I covered. At the top, we talked about all the different ways to back up Active Directory and restore it. And once we've restored it, the difference between a non-authoritative restore and an authoritative restore, and what objects are contained within the system state. And that to understand that when we do an authoritative restore, we have to reboot the computer in what's called Directory Services Restore mode. And that's a mode of Windows that takes the Active Directory offline. The fact that we do have an Active Directory recycle bin and we can recover deleted objects and we've got a 12-hour window to do so. We then also touched on the benefits of an RODC, a read-only domain controller. Thank you.